All righty. Welcome, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started, although we'll probably have some more folks trickling in the next few minutes. Welcome to this Clean Energy Transition Institute webinar. The Northwest stands to gain jobs with the clean energy transition. My name is Jamie Ptacek. I use she, hers pronouns, and I'm CETI's communication manager. I'm super thrilled that so many folks are here today to learn more about our Net Zero Northwest workforce analysis. Before we get underway, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that here in Seattle, I'm standing on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded land of the Coast Salish people, past and present, which include the Suquamish, Duwamish, and Stillaguamish tribes. I want to recognize and honor their past and ongoing stewardship of these lands, and also acknowledge their history of dispossession and forced removal, and respect their rights to sovereignty and self-determination. If you don't know whose lands you're on, this resource that we are sharing in the chat is a really great tool. It's not comprehensive, but it's a really good place to start. So I encourage you all to spend some time learning about tribal sovereignty and treaty rights of those whose lands you occupy. Before we dive into the data, just a few notes on participating in this webinar. We are recording this event, and the recording as well as the slide deck will be shared with you in a follow-up email later this week. Katie McNabb, our program and development assistant, will be posting links and resources in the chat throughout the webinar, but our team, which you can navigate in the toolbar that's at the bottom of your screen, as you can see pictured here on this slide. Please use the Q&A function to ask questions, not the chat. The Q&A box can be accessed in the toolbar at the bottom of the screen. We will have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the webinar, but our team will also do our best to answer your questions in the Q&A chat box as they come up. So no need to wait until the end to ask a question if you have one. Closed captioning is also being provided for this event, and you can also access that by clicking the Show Captions and then the View Full Transcript buttons in that bottom toolbar. And if you're having trouble finding any of those features, you might have to click the three little dots on the bottom toolbar that say More, and hopefully you'll be able to access them that way. If you have any technical difficulties whatsoever, please reach out to me at jamie@cleanenergytransition.org, and I will do my best to help you. For a quick preview of today's agenda, we'll first hear from Eileen Quigley, our Executive Director, who will talk a little bit about the Clean Energy Transition Institute and our Net Zero Northwest work more broadly. Then Ruby Moore-Bloom, our CETI Research Analyst, and Claire Buysse, our CETI Research Fellow, will dive into the results of our workforce analysis and the interactive visualizations that are on our website, which will allow you to explore the data in more detail. And then, like I mentioned, we'll end our time together with a Q&A session to address as many questions as we can. And then once the webinar concludes, you'll be automatically directed to a survey in your web browser, and we would love for you to take a few minutes to fill it out because it really will help inform our work moving forward. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Eileen, CETI's Executive Director, to talk more about the Institute and our Net Zero Northwest work.
Good morning to all. Thank you so very much for joining us. My name is Eileen Quigley, and I use she, her pronouns. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share the results of the Clean Energy Transition Institute's Net Zero Northwest workforce analysis. We're very excited to have 138 people registered for this webinar. I'm going to speak very briefly about the Clean Energy Transition Institute, for which I am the founding executive director, and the Net Zero Northwest study before I turn it over to my team to dive into the results of the analysis. Clean Energy Transition Institute is an independent, nonpartisan research and analysis nonprofit organization whose mission is to accelerate an equitable transition to a clean energy economy in the Northwest. We provide neutral data analytics and best practices about decarbonization to enable fact-based conversations among stakeholders and policymakers about the smartest strategies, actions, and policies to pursue to decrease carbon emissions as swiftly and as equitably as the climate science tells us we must. The Net Zero Northwest Workforce Analysis is the third installment of our Net Zero Northwest study. In June of this year, we released the Energy Pathways and Health Impact Analyses. The reason we undertook the Net Zero Northwest analysis was to provide up-to-date deep decarbonization pathways data for how the Northwest might achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Our focus was on what must happen in the region to accelerate the clean energy transition equitably from now until 2030-35. We also wanted to understand how the Inflation Reduction Act incentives would affect the costs of different decarbonization strategies. And we wanted to model the health impacts of reducing tailpipe and smokestack emissions, as well as analyze the jobs lost or gained if the region were to transition to net zero emissions. The technical modeling underpinning the Energy Pathway study provided the input data for both the health impacts and workforce analysis studies. This slide is showing you the final results of the Energy Pathways core case modeling across the 5 intertwined pillars of deep decarbonization. Deep decarbonization is a systemic and economy-wide approach to removing emissions from all sectors of the economy. Hence, we're not just considering the electricity emissions or the fuel emissions in isolation. Instead, we examine the interaction of a diverse mix of energy sources across the electricity, buildings, transportation, and fuel sectors. When Ruby discusses the workforce analysis results, she will explain how the Energy Pathways findings fed into the employment impacts. Next slide. Here's where you can find the details about the Energy Pathways analysis, and Katie is also placing links in the chat along the way. I'm now going to pass the mic over to Ruby, who will begin the presentation on the workforce analysis findings, and I thank you all again very much for attending.
Thanks so much, Eileen. My name is Ruby Moore Bloom, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm going to be sharing results from this analysis. So this study is the Northwest's first comprehensive clean energy workforce analysis, and the technical analysis was developed by BW Research Partnership, a national applied research firm that analyzes economic and workforce data. BW Research has produced the U.S. Energy and Employment Jobs Report for the Department of Energy since 2016. For this analysis, BW Research examined the jobs to be created or displaced if the Northwest were to achieve net zero emissions as evolved modeled, and as Eileen mentioned earlier. This analysis looks at jobs by occupation and industry in the electricity, fuels, buildings, and transportation sectors throughout the region. And today we're talking about regional results for the whole Northwest, but in early 2024, we will also release state-specific results for Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and Washington. I want to start with some definitions. So first, this analysis includes impact on both direct employment, meaning jobs that are associated with the initial economic impact of an investment, as well as indirect employment, meaning associated with the supply chain. There are also impacts on induced employment, which is based on additional household spending. So for example, if the Net Zero Northwest Energy Pathways analysis shows development of a certain level of solar capacity, direct and indirect employment would refer to the workers contributing to the development of that project over time or to the supply chain associated with the component parts. And induced employment would refer to jobs that could be supported in the local economy based on those solar workers spending their wages. And while they are not energy jobs per se, induced jobs can point to the broader effects of energy investment in a local economy. BW Research also performs separate analyses that group jobs by industry, listed here, and these are more of an economic development lens showing the impact of energy investments. And there's another analysis by occupation. So this is what the worker is actually doing within each sector, and this can provide more insight for workforce training needs. Lastly, there is a wage tier analysis, and these wage tiers were developed by BW Research and based on the MIT Living Wage Calculator at median living wages for different living circumstances in each of the 4 Northwest states. Throughout this presentation, we focus on the near-term results, mostly from now until 2030, even though the study modeled jobs through 2050. Uncertainty increases the farther out we get, and we want to focus on what would need to happen in the next several years to put us on the path to net zero by 2050. Overall, we found that a transition to net zero would support a 17% increase in energy employment in the Northwest by 2030. The figure shown here includes direct, indirect, and induced jobs, and that 17% increase is actually the same even if induced jobs are excluded. You can see that this growth is largely driven by increases in the buildings in yellow and electricity sectors in green, to a lesser extent the fuel sector in dark blue, and transportation in turquoise here is a little bit of a more complicated story. You can see it peaks slightly in 2025 and comes back down in 2030. We'll get into those details in some later slides. An equitable clean energy transition won't happen on its own, and it will be important to implement strategies that prioritize job quality and equity to make sure that the transition not only brings the job growth we're looking at here, but that these jobs are high quality. I'm now going to get into sector-specific results, starting with electricity. Electrification, clean electricity, and transmission are critical components to a net zero emissions future. Electricity is inherently more efficient than fossil fuels in many applications. And as electric appliances and electric vehicles replace today's fossil fuel-based equipment, electricity demand increases significantly, as does demand for the resources and jobs required to create and move that electricity. The Energy Pathways analysis found that economy-wide electricity demand would more than double between 2021 and 2050. When we look at the near-term job impacts, we see that net employment supported by the electricity sector increases by 43% between 2021 and 2030 as part of meeting that demand. This figure shown here shows direct and indirect jobs in darker green and induced jobs in lighter green. When we are talking about the electricity sector, here are the subsectors included, as well as a brief description and some example direct jobs that would fall into each subsector. I'm not going to read through this in detail, but you can find it on the website, and there's a link in the chat. Here we are looking at those electricity subsectors. So all of the subsectors included in the electricity analysis. First, starting with their baseline employment. Our baseline year for this study was 2021, and then followed by the change in employment, both by 2025 in darker blue and 2030 in lighter blue. That's on the right here. So these numbers on the right are showing the change, not the total jobs, and the numbers on the left are showing the baseline jobs. We found that nearly all electricity subsectors support job growth by 2030. 2 subsectors that decline are natural gas generation and other fossil generation. In terms of growth, land-based wind jobs see the most growth, a result of the large-scale development of wind resources in the Energy Pathways analysis. Transmission and distribution subsectors also contribute significantly to growth in electricity jobs, as improvements and expansions to the transmission and grid systems are necessary to meet changing load requirements, increases in electricity needs, and changes in generation mixes in the Northwest. So here are the land-based wind jobs growing, as well as distribution and transmission jobs. Not shown in this figure, but there's more detail on the webpage, are the categories by industry and by occupation. So in terms of industry, construction industry sees the most growth in employment, adding over 21,200 jobs by 2030, as investments spur new development of land-based wind and construction activities around electricity distribution and transmission. Manufacturing jobs also see strong growth, adding more than 5,200 jobs, which could establish career-long employment opportunities as opposed to shorter-term construction job opportunities. In terms of occupations, installation and repair jobs grow the most by 55% between 2021 and 2030. These jobs grow to install land-based wind and other activities in support of electricity distribution and transmission. Management and professional jobs also grow significantly, and these jobs are important to keep project timelines on track and to consider impacts to surrounding ecosystems and communities. So again, these details on industry and occupation are not shown in the figure here, but when Claire looks at the interactive visualizations on the webpage with you all, you'll see where to find that information. With new installed generating capacity, the Northwest could see a dramatic increase in demand for workers in the electricity sector. As renewables take over, jobs in fossil fuel electricity generation experience net decreases in employment. The energy pathways modeling assumes that new gas generating capacity will use biomass methane gas, which could theoretically open transition opportunities for current natural gas generation workers, as the facilities themselves could remain in place, but the fuel would switch. This may require retraining workers on new processes and day-to-day operating, but there would likely be many transferable skills and possibilities for current workers to transition, as long as there's the right planning and support. In both 2021 and 2030, nearly half of the electricity sector jobs earn below $30 an hour, pointing to the importance of centering job quality in conversations about growing the electricity workforce. We're now moving on to the fuels sector. Today, the Northwest supplies 98% of its fuel demand with fossil fuels. Achieving net zero emissions by 2050 would require both decreasing the total amount of fuel needed and also lowering the carbon intensity by producing alternative clean fuels. The Energy Pathways analysis found that after achieving aggressive reductions in end-use fuel consumption with energy efficiency, clean electricity, and electrification, there are still energy uses that are difficult to decarbonize and therefore must rely on low-carbon liquid and gaseous fuels. The fuels sector therefore experiences simultaneous job loss in fossil fuel subsectors and significant job growth in clean fuel subsectors. And despite the displaced jobs in fossil fuel subsector, the fuel sector as a whole supports a net increase of nearly 19% in employment between 2021 and 2030. Again, this figure is showing direct and indirect jobs in darker blue and induced jobs in lighter blue. Here is the subsector detail for the fuels sector. And of these subsectors, biofuels and hydrogen are the two that are considered the alternative or clean fuels subsectors. And again, the link to find this table should be in the chat. Here we are looking at those fuels subsectors, again, looking at baseline employment on the left, and then change by 2025 and 2030 on the right. In terms of the growing subsectors, hydrogen stands out here, supporting more than 11,000 net jobs, while biofuels supports more than 1,400 by 2030. The Energy Pathways analysis found that the need for clean fuels is more acute in the Northwest than in other parts of the United States, due to a relatively clean grid and Washington's aggressive 2030 emissions reduction target. Further, Inflation Reduction Act incentives mean that hydrogen production is economic by 2030 in this analysis. These Energy Pathways results drive the increase in hydrogen fuels jobs shown here. Of the remaining declining subsectors, natural gas distribution drops the most, with more than a quarter displaced, largely due to decreased natural gas usage in buildings from electrification measures. However, this modeling does not capture potential continued employment associated with leak detection, repair, and decommissioning work, nor potential opportunities for displaced natural gas distribution workers to transition to clean fuels jobs. Similar to electricity, employment mostly grows in construction and manufacturing industries, as construction and operations of new hydrogen and biofuel production facilities and infrastructure take root in the region. The increase in construction and operation of these facilities drives the need for installation, repair, and production manufacturing occupations. Managerial and professional roles are also projected to expand significantly, bringing with them good wages. The fuel sector offers opportunities to make use of available skilled labor and to mitigate negative impacts to displaced fossil fuel workers. Resources should be allocated specifically toward training and transitioning displaced workers into new opportunities, such as the production, distribution, and storage of hydrogen and biofuels. However, a complicating factor could be location. The Energy Pathways analysis found it would be economic to co-locate production of hydrogen and the subsequent clean fuels along with high-quality renewable resources, which may not exist in the same locations as workers in existing natural gas and fossil fuel jobs. The share of jobs paying below $30 an hour increases slightly from 2021 to 2030. Therefore, strategies that increase wages and benefits should be prioritized when considering workforce needs for this sector. Moving on to the third of four sectors, the building sector. As mentioned, the energy pathways analysis found that electrification is the most economic decarbonization pathway in many applications, particularly in buildings. The modeling assumes rapid electrification of residential and commercial gas appliances and transition to high-efficiency building technology and high-efficiency building shells, all of which reach 100% sales by 2035. This analysis found that the building sector supports a 22% net increase in jobs by 2030. And again, we're looking at direct and indirect in darker yellow and induced jobs in lighter yellow. The transition to zero carbon buildings provides opportunity for workforce development to meet this growing demand for electrification, energy efficiency activities, and retrofits in both residential and commercial buildings. Here are the subsectors included in the building sector. And I think the detail on the two other categories could be particularly helpful here. Again, this table is available on the website, and there should be a link in the chat for you. Once again, we are looking at baseline jobs on the left and net change on the right. Between 2021 and 2030, none of the building subsectors see employment declines as energy efficiency and building electrification and decarbonization efforts ramp up. Investment into high efficiency and low carbon residential HVAC and other commercial and residential technologies outpaces cutbacks to higher carbon building technologies, such as gas furnaces, resulting in overall investment and employment growth. You can see that commercial HVAC and residential shell jobs experience significant growth in particular. As with the other sectors, the construction industry sees the most growth in employment, supporting over 18,000 additional jobs by 2030, as investments spur an increase in electrification and energy efficiency activities, both in new building construction and in building retrofits. These electrification and energy efficiency activities lead to a projected 33% growth among buildings, installation, and repair occupations, highlighting the need to focus workforce development efforts there. Electrification of the building sector represents a significant opportunity and challenge for workforce development. All building subsectors experience net job growth, so there is less of a concern about transitioning displaced workers. But there is still a significant need for updated apprenticeship programs, continuing education programs, and other curricula to ensure that workers have the opportunity to continuously learn about the installation and maintenance of newer, lower carbon versions of HVAC technology and appliances. Compared to the other energy sectors in this analysis, the building sector has the highest percentage of jobs that earn more than $30 an hour. Although due to the size of this sector, that low wage tier still has a significant number of workers, so efforts to address job quality remain very important. Last but not least, we are moving to the transportation sector. Transportation is the #1 source of greenhouse gas emissions in the Northwest today. And the energy pathways analysis found that electrification of vehicle fleets results in significant cost savings relative to other net zero emission options. This means that the transportation sector and its associated jobs would undergo a huge transformation on the road to net zero. Zero emissions vehicles, ZEVs, which would include electric vehicles, EVs, as well as hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, and their supporting infrastructure would replace gas-powered internal combustion engine vehicles and conventional fueling stations or gas stations. The energy pathways modeling assumes 100% ZEV sales by 2035 for light and medium duty passenger vehicles. The modeling also assumes the same number of vehicle miles traveled as today, although we are already seeing efforts in the Northwest to reduce vehicle miles traveled and invest in more robust multimodal forms of transit. Pursuing these strategies could change the picture for the transportation sector from what we're seeing here. Employment supported by the transportation sector increases by about 1% between 2021 and 2030, but you can see that it peaks slightly in 2025 before coming back down. With some subsectors declining, namely conventional fueling stations, and others increasing. And we'll look at those details in the next slides. Same as before, here's the transportation subsector detail available on the website for you all to peruse. And I mentioned the conventional fueling stations jobs. I just wanted to point out some of these example direct jobs would be cashiers, retail managers, and service station attendants. So we've seen this figure a few times now. Baseline employment is on the left, baseline in 2021, and the change is on the right, change either by 2025 or by 2030. First, we can see a big increase in vehicle maintenance jobs by 2025, and that's what leads transportation jobs to peak in this year. That's because there's the most overlap between existing internal combustion engine vehicles and new zero-emission vehicles. However, by 2030, there's a decrease in net transportation jobs overall, and that largely reflects this loss in conventional fueling station jobs. This overall decline is based on modeling assumptions about the number of charging devices, expected charging station maintenance needs, and impacts to fueling stations. Of course, in reality, there are many questions about what this transition will look like for conventional fueling stations and their associated workers. The simultaneous employment growth and decline in transportation industries reflects the complexity of the transition. We therefore provided more detailed industry categories for transportation than for other sectors. Claire is going to get into a figure that shows these more detailed industry categories when she does the interactive visualizations. But again, these are not shown in the figure on the screen here, but they provide additional detail on the transportation sector. So the increasing stock of zero-emission vehicles and charging stations doubles the employment in the construction industry. However, we can see that charging stations only account for 77 jobs in 2021. And so this doubling of construction jobs is only 1% of total transportation jobs in 2030. A much larger transportation industry is wholesale and retail trade jobs, and these decline by 2030 as the number of conventional fueling stations drops. The automotive repair and maintenance industry, on the other hand, adds jobs by 2030. But by 2050, these automotive repair and maintenance jobs decrease as electric vehicles capture more of the market share and require less maintenance than internal combustion engine vehicles. This leads to an overall net decrease in transportation sector jobs between 2021 and 2050. On the occupation side, management and professional jobs grow more than other transportation occupations. During the same time period, administrative positions decline, driven by losses in the conventional fueling stations. For context, I wanted to show this figure, which shows all of the subsectors that were included in the analysis. This is looking at 2030, and you can see that the top three employing subsectors are all from the transportation sector. So even though the transportation sector experiences the smallest percent growth and a lot of displacement from 2021 to 2030, it still supports more employment than any other energy sector in 2030. Transportation presents important opportunities for the region to meet its decarbonization goals by fostering a zero-emissions vehicle transition. However, this sector's decarbonization transition must take into account the uncertainty surrounding conventional fueling station workers. There are also concerns from auto workers about the impact of the electric vehicle transition on high-quality union jobs in the automotive sector. Most transportation sector jobs pay below $30 an hour, making transportation the energy sector with the biggest share of jobs in this low-wage tier. It is therefore incumbent upon regional stakeholders, including economic development agencies, unions, community colleges, and workforce development experts, to seek ways to address these challenges. I will leave you with a few final thoughts before passing it over to Claire. The Net Zero Northwest Workforce Analysis offers regional policymakers direction for how employment would shift over time as the region moves towards attaining a net zero emissions goal by 2050. While fossil fuel-related jobs would decline, on balance, net energy jobs in the Northwest would grow by 17% between 2021 and 2030. The question for the region stakeholders is how to manage the transition to clean energy in such a way that as many people as possible benefit, either by having access to jobs that were previously foreclosed or by receiving training that would enable them to learn new skills and maintain a good standard of living. To this end, it will be critical to promote strategies that ensure job quality is a priority in the transition to a clean energy economy. As I mentioned, early next year, we will be releasing state-level analyses for the 4 Northwest states, and we look forward to engaging with many of you in those conversations as well. I will now pass it over to Claire Buysse to look at some interactive visualizations on the Net Zero Northwest website.
Thanks, Ruby. My name is Claire Buysse, and I use she, her. I'm going to show a couple of visualizations of the employment data on our webpage and walk through some of their interactive features. Just let me share my screen real quick. All right, so here is our Net Zero Northwest webpage. This is the landing page, and on the left, you can see all of that information on our energy and health modeling. And I'm going to go to the workforce section, which houses all of the work that we've been presenting here. And on this page, you can see some context on why we embarked on this study, as well as a summary of key findings. You can see these other 2 tabs have methodology and assumptions, but our key findings page houses most of our figures and takeaways. I want to walk through one figure here, which you've seen a version of that Ruby showed, and that's this one right here. Figure 1, Northwest Energy Employment by Subsector. On the left, you'll see employment by subsector in 2021. And on the right, you'll see the change from 2021 to 2030. And as you kind of hover over these, you can see conventional fueling stations. And in the tooltip, this box that pops up here, you'll see the absolute number of jobs, as well as the share of total. So conventional fueling stations in 2021 represented 14% of total jobs. And you can also spotlight just to see that the transportation sector really is accounting for a lot of the jobs in energy employment in 2021. And then on the right, you see the percent change. For example, we can look at land-based wind. On the left, you see about 8,000 jobs in 2021, but on the right, you see like massive growth in land-based wind, about 200%, and adding an additional 16 to 17,000 jobs. We also have a radio button here up top that shows, so you can toggle the left side between 2021 and 2030. So if you look at land-based wind, it shows huge growth. And when you toggle, let me just highlight electricity here. When you toggle to 2030, you'll see that land-based wind shifts up on the list, and now it's representing 4% of total jobs in 2030. But this data on the right has stayed the same throughout. On the rest of this page, you can see a couple other figures. I guess still loading here. This one shows direct and induced employment. We have another that you can toggle through industry, and you can also show it by occupation and by wage. And this is showing data for all of the sectors: electricity, buildings, fuels, and transportation. There's another last figure on wage tier with accompanying context and some concluding thoughts. And we have a PDF of our workforce key findings that you can download here. And then at the bottom of this page, you'll see links to the other sectors. So you can explore each one individually. You can also find those on the left-hand side. So for example, if we go to the electricity sector, you'll see this table that Ruby showed several times for each of the sectors, and you can find that the first thing you'll see on each of the sector pages, along with accompanying text. For each sector, we have very similar figures and context. This one you'll see is very familiar from the presentation that Ruby was showing for 2025 and 2030, and here you can tab through each of those for baseline employment and change for these subsectors. We also slice the data by industry category, and I'll walk through one of these for the transportation sector a bit later. And then we also have data by occupation and by wage. And so these figures are the same for each of the sectors. I want to walk through one that is extra. We have one specifically extra figure for the buildings sector, and that's because the buildings categories have a lot of detail that's not captured. So I'm going to scroll here. This is an extra figure that we only have for buildings, and it's detailing the investment by building subsectors. So the subsectors, there's 5 subsectors here on the left, and then you can see a little more detail in the next column about what's actually included in each of those subsectors. And if I scroll here, just showing 2025, you can see space heating and refrigeration are really leading investment there. Space heating includes heat pumps. And if you hover over the tooltip, you can see the investment dollars in that year, and then can slide to show how that changes by adding 2030 and then adding in 2035. And you can really see space heating and refrigeration, kind of commercial space heating and refrigeration, really dwarfing investment for those really big commercial spaces. The next thing I'll show here, I'm going to go to the transportation sector, and I want to walk through those industry figures. So same figures that you saw for the rest, but for transportation, we have a little bit more detail on the industry categories. So just to orient you with this figure, we have a year slider. We can go to 2030, for example, and right now we're showing all of the subsectors, and we're showing the share of jobs in 2030 by these different industry categories. We're showing all subsectors, but we can actually individually check them. So for example, if we look at charging stations, you can see that that's mostly construction jobs, and you can hover and see that's 1,000 jobs. You can also check and just look at conventional fueling stations. Those are mainly represented with wholesale and retail trade jobs. For vehicle maintenance, there's actually a specific categories that we have broken out: automotive repair and maintenance, that makes up most of the jobs. And then again, for manufacturing, you can see this representing the bulk of jobs along with some professional services. And you can check any combination of these subsectors to look at them together. But let's just look at all of them. And then again, you can scroll through the years. So back in 2021, I'll just do this slowly so you can kind of see the shift in the makeup of, oh, it went all the way. The shift in the makeup of jobs over time. We're getting like fewer wholesale and retail trade jobs, a few more professional services, automotive repair and maintenance, and manufacturing over time. And last figure that I want to just take a second to show is just slicing it by occupation. So the last figure was by industry category, and this one's by occupation. So those categories that may be really helpful to inform workforce training. Right here, this is just showing the 2021 baseline, and I'm going to highlight that. I'm actually just going to click this like keep only. So I'm not even looking at 2030 data anymore. And this is sorted so we can see management and professional jobs are representing most of them. If you look at this tooltip, it's about 42,500 jobs, and that's representing 26% of all of the transportation sector jobs. And then if I want to go back and see 2030, I can click this reset button at the bottom, and it will show the 2030 change. So this change here is highlighted, and you can see for some of the occupations, it's growth. So you see growth for management professional jobs, for other jobs, a little bit for installation and repair and sales. But then for example, administrative jobs, it's probably representing a lot of those fuel station attendants. You actually see a decline in jobs, and same thing with a small amount of production and manufacturing. And so then this net line shows the overall jobs. And so it's not at the end for administrative and production and manufacturing jobs. I think that's the last one that I have for you here. But there's still other figures to explore on the webpage. Thank you so much for your interest and attention. I'm going to pass it back to Jamie.
All righty, thank you, Claire. Okay, the time has come for our Q&A session. There are already some questions coming in. Again, to ask a question, please navigate to the Q&A box that's in your Zoom toolbar and ask us anything that might have come up about our Net Zero Northwest workforce analysis. We'll do our best to get through as many as we can in the next 15 minutes. We have quite a bit of time, so any questions that are on your mind, please let us know. We will also be updating our Net Zero Northwest FAQ sheet, which lives in that Net Zero Northwest website we were just in, with workforce-specific questions that we hear today. So if we don't get to your question live, it will be addressed in that FAQ document on the website, and we'll make sure to include that in our follow-up email to you all as well. So now I'll hand it over to Eileen, who's going to moderate, and Claire and Ruby will be helping to answer questions as well.
All right. So from Tim Miller, hi Tim, so good to have you with us. Two questions. The first is, it looks like induced includes impacts of wages to do this work, but what about the impact of spending the savings generated by clean energy and the economic impact of clean energy dollars circulating in our economy versus the fossil fuel dollars that may leave our region? So at the highest level, I would say we didn't model either of these. Both extremely interesting questions and a different kind of modeling than what BW did. But I will certainly look to Ruby or Claire to see if you have any more color on that. It's definitely something that we've been interested in, and when we did the state energy strategy is something we looked at, but it's different than the kind of modeling that BW did, taking the energy pathways data. I don't know if Ruby has anything or Claire to add.
Yeah, I think that is my understanding of the modeling as well. But this type of modeling is not a macroeconomic general equilibrium model. So it's really only looking at the changes in these 4 sectors. So I think that's part of why those questions that you asked are outside of the scope.
However, really important and interesting, and ones that we are certainly very interested in pursuing. And we've been having a lot of conversations with BW about where we want to take this work in 2024 and what kind of economic analysis they could do that would actually not be derived specifically from the energy pathways data, but from other kinds of economic analysis they do for all kinds of cities and regions around the country. And this is definitely a topic that they are able to model. And Tim, you had another excellent question, which I'm going to let Ruby answer. Surprisingly low number of workers in charging stations category. Can you comment on that? What is included, not included?
Yeah, so the surprisingly small number was probably the 77 charging station jobs in the baseline year, which was 2021. And BW Research used their U.S. Energy and Employment Jobs Report, as well as Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS, complementary labor market data to establish that employment. So those would be the 2 sources to look to. But these charging station jobs should include manufacturing, installation, and maintenance. So I don't know enough about the industry and specifically to say how that compares to other job numbers or why it was surprisingly low to you, but it was also 2021 as the baseline year, and definitely is projected to grow within this analysis by 2030.
Tim, did that get to the answer to your question? I don't know if Tim can speak. We'll certainly put something in the chat or back in Q&A. James, also excellent to hear you, to see you here and have you join us. Thank you so much. Would you say that the implication of this analysis, especially around the transportation sector, is that the stakeholders you mentioned, economic development agencies, community colleges, need to map out what skills are transferable? Is there any mapping of human capacity skills mix to new jobs? Another excellent question, and actually one that we have been specifically talking to BW about. I will let Ruby answer with a little bit more detail on what the next step could be. But this is something we are extremely interested in doing. And I would also mention that 2 of our funders, Career Connect Washington and the Clean Tech Alliance, are also extremely interested in this as well. And I should also have mentioned my gratitude to both of those entities for giving us some money towards this study. So Ruby, anything you want to add about the assessment?
Yeah,
studies?
I think like you said, we look at this Net Zero Northwest workforce analysis really as a kind of baseline and foundation, but definitely a starting place, not an ending place. And what you mentioned, James, as a next step is something that we would be really excited about and seems like a logical next step. One version of that is something called a comprehensive workforce needs assessment. And this is something that BW Research has done before. So for example, they did one for Massachusetts. It was a follow-up study based on Massachusetts Clean Energy and Climate Plan. And the workforce needs assessment provides a more granular level of analysis, even getting to, forecasts of electricians per subsector, for example, and also includes collaboration with education and training institutions, unions, employers, other community-based organizations to try to identify opportunities that could actually support the development of a diverse and equitable workforce, and some of that kind of skill mapping that you're talking about and actual capacity mapping as well. So yeah, not included in this analysis, but definitely a potential next step.
Yes, and I would add that this area is rich and complicated, and one that CETI is approaching with a lot of humility, because we are learning as we go, but we're extremely interested in partnering, especially with the many people who are on this, who signed up for this webinar, who are experts in this area, and to provide whatever data would be very helpful to enable an equitable transition around employment. Next question is from Shelley Carlton, and it was in the chat. What is included in the investments in figures 1 and 2 for building technologies? So Ruby, I think we want to go back to figures 1 and 2 for building technologies.
I think that was what I believe that's what Claire was showing.
Oh, Claire was showing
the detail by buildings.
Right.
Those subcategories of investment, and those are derived from the Evolved Energy Research Energy Pathways analysis. So less thinking about, it's not the input is directly derived from what the Energy Pathways analysis found about investment in those building subsectors. And so they get to the level of a device type and then the amount of investment that would be needed to support that device type growing by X amount to reach those energy goals. And then that's translated into jobs. But the one that Claire was showing was just kind of going back a step, looking at the investment before it's translated into jobs. I don't know if that, if you would add anything else to that, Claire.
No, that's great.
I'm happy to talk to you more about that, Shelley, if you're interested in and dig deeper into the energy pathways assumptions. Brownface, asking a very important question in the chat. Some of the findings presented demonstrate the potential for wages to dip below $30 an hour. Any recommendations here, labor standards for for future or further studies? Sorry, mangled your question a little bit. And then he added, or at least an increase in the percentage of workers. So who wants to take this, the wage? Is that Ruby?
Yeah, I can start. I'm smiling because I would point to the Blue-Green Alliance for this answer, actually, and Ramses is from the Blue-Green Alliance. So I think one thing we looked at in this analysis was the federal government taking some steps in this direction through the Inflation Reduction Act. So one mechanism is a bonus tax credit that is now linking prevailing wage requirements and apprenticeship requirements to the level of clean energy tax credit that is available, or tax incentive that's available. And this prevailing wage has historically been used and established for public works or federal construction projects, but it's now for the first time being tied to clean energy tax incentives. I think it still remains to be seen what that, how that is used, and people still have to take advantage of it and still have to know about it. But that's one thing that we looked at. And then we looked at the Blue-Green Alliance resource, the IRA guidebook. And so I would point back to that for a really helpful comprehensive list of policy tools, both in the Inflation Reduction Act and more broadly, that can be used to help ensure the creation of quality jobs. And I think, maybe the last thing I'll say on this is, as CETI, you're looking at our full team right here, our full-time staff, and so we are small but rely a lot on collaboration with partners in the region. And so we look forward to talking to you and others more as we continue to work on this.
And
And
if I
back
can
to
just,
the Q&A. Oh, did you have something, Claire? We have
I
a
was
bunch
just
of-
going to add a small thing of like, I think it's really great that we got this question about wages, because I think that was really the goal of our work in general on workforces, to say like, what's the baseline, what's going to happen, and now we can understand kind of where to get at that and what questions we need to be asking and where we need to put our focus. So really great that you're already thinking that way.
James is asking in the Q&A methodology, electricity generation, what was the cutoff for new technologies to be considered in the models for energy generation capacity growth, i.e. small scale geothermal using horizontal drilling from oil and gas sector, which also could serve as a job replacement strategy, or micro turbines on irrigation canals, more rural employment, or offshore wave action electrical generation. These are all related to the energy pathways study. And I would actually have to ask Jeremy about each of these specific technologies and strategies and solutions. I know that they model many, but I can't tell you here now, but I will get back to you, James, on that, or I will put you together with Jeremy so he can go under the hood a bit with you on that. Donna, Albert, lovely to have you here with us. Thank you for joining. How can I view the climate emissions of electrofuels, biofuels, synfuels, or BECCS in your clean fuels pathways and the underlying assumptions? These fuels may have high climate emissions depending on the entire life cycle analysis, which must include direct and indirect land use emissions. Biofuels and BECCS tend to have high climate emissions. I need more specific. Totally understand the question. This is also for Jeremy, and we will take this offline and get all of this to you. Tony, excellent to see you. Did the analysis incorporate any statistical analysis of confidence levels and the estimated jobs in FWA? I'm not quite sure what that is. If so, did you identify what factors influence that uncertainty? That's an interesting question. I'm not quite sure I understand the second part, the estimated job in FWA. So maybe Tony, we can take this offline, and I can put you together with Mitch, the modeler at BW, so that he can answer the questions of confidence levels and uncertainty. Hey, has job forecast included the effects of artificial intelligence? Not that I know of, and doubt it, but an interesting question. Thanks for doing this work. Okay, great. Rich. Hey, Rich, in addressing biomass transition from natural gas jobs, you mentioned methane. Where does the short-term dangerous methane come from? And how did you study it? I think that this is also a Jeremy question. This is more on energy pathways, and I'm happy to get you specifics about how Jeremy models the GHG impact of methane. Benjamin from the Clean Tech Alliance, what is the role of academia, unions, training institutions to support this transition? Understanding that the market dictates industry growth and political incentives, and training, unions, academia respond based on this growth. With this analysis, we have a picture of the future needs of the workforce, but many jobs are not there yet, and it takes 2 years to create a new training program. Totally agree with you. Really important point. I think that what we were trying to do with this study was give all of our colleagues in the community who are working in these areas a sense of what is required, but I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done. And this is kind of similar to an earlier question that we answered about how do we get more granular about what actually is needed. And I think there's all kinds of work that needs to be done. Ecosystem assessment of where the resources are already, or what are the resources, job training, et cetera. And also the questions of ensuring that the wages are fair and prevailing, et cetera, and there's good labor standards. A lot of work to do in this area. Okay, Tim, how am I doing here? Sorry. Okay, we have a few more. Starts to address Tim charging station. I would really be interested to do a rough check on the future jobs numbers, i.e. doing some assumptions on the number of charge. Yeah, backing into how many per year, how many hours, just doing that basic math. I think that's an interesting idea, Tim, and it's something we've been talking about here in a different context, which is there some kind of way that we can be tracking data that actually indicate how we're doing, like ground up data, how we're doing against our targets? It's actually something that I put forth to the board. So I will definitely talk to you more about this. Hi, Nancy. Riffing on the transferability of jobs. Was there any specific analysis on the pipe fitters and opportunities for them when fossil distribution systems decline? There was not, but this is something we have specifically talked to BW Research about. So definitely something that we're very interested in pursuing. An excellent question. Okay, Haynes. Has there been any consideration of how the distribution of jobs spatially across the region might change? Are there any constraints or obstacles in trying to put new jobs where there will be expected job losses under a clean energy transition? Ruby, I don't know if you or Claire want to handle this. I mean, the distribution of jobs is directly derived from the energy pathways, and where we know from that resources will be needed and built. So yeah, there is geographic distribution, but it's modeled as opposed to what might be, specifically.
Right. Yeah, that's how I would answer it. And also that when we do the state specific analyses early next year, we'll have a little bit more to say here about how the jobs are distributed across the region. But as a modeling project, this is looking at demand for workers, not the supply of workers. And so it does not get into where those workers are coming from, aside from the baseline of where workers already exist. But it's a good question.
Yeah, and I think absolutely, like the really location specific stuff almost has to be qualitative, like not in a modeling sense, or like really localized. And I think some of the best we can get at is looking at those transition opportunities. I think Ruby mentioned earlier with biomethane from natural gas, but as like a whole picture, I think that's a really hard question to get at and needs to be parsed a little bit.
I'm watching the time, and I guess, Jamie, can I take any more questions, or are we going to need to take these and write them up? Well, as we said, we're going to be sending out written answers to all of the questions with additional resources. So all questions will get answered. I just don't know if we're 1 minute away.
Yeah, if there's one, like maybe one more you think you could answer quickly, and if not, we can just make sure we address all of these.
I think that this last one that I see in the Q&A is really important. It's, does any of your projections include, whoops, it disappeared. Thanks.
It's just in the answered.
Sorry, that was my fault.
Okay.
Does it include demographic information? Is there a sense of how the makeup of barriers to equitable access for frontline and underserved communities, how the makeup, I think how that may change. Yeah, I think I can't quite parse it, but we don't have demographic information here. I think there's some current demographic information, but it doesn't have quite the resolution to look by a specific subsector. I'll pass it back to Eileen if you want to add anything there.
Right, and I think it's an incredibly important question, and it fits also with the answer I gave earlier about how we need to get more granular in next steps with this data. Okay, well, we're at 11, so I'm going to thank you all so much for joining us today. Please take a few minutes to fill out the survey that's going to appear in your browser when you exit. This will help us inform our work. Please also let us know how you think the study might be useful. If you want to stay up to date, please consider subscribing to our newsletter. Please do not hesitate to reach out with any questions if you're interested in having briefings. And do not hesitate to reach out if you're interested in the state-specific analyses we're developing. So on behalf of the clean energy transition, I want to thank everybody for joining us and for the excellent questions and answers. And we'll be getting back to you in the coming days with the slide deck, the survey link, recording and the Q&A. I think with that, we're done. Thank you very much.